10:02. Welcome, everyone. So excited to be here, or should I say, it's our last day of the conference today, and wonderful to have everyone joining us. I'm going to give it a moment. I'm Li-Ming Stroh. I get to be Evan today. I feel like I have very, very big shoes to fill. A little scary, Keith and Melissa. So I'm gonna bring you guys on and introduce you guys before everyone's like, where are all the master sommeliers? So we have from the great state of Texas, Keith Goldston. Hey, Keith.
Hey. So if you get to be Evan, does that mean I get to be you and kind of like, Evan, hurry up, we're running late.
Right? Yeah, exactly. And of course, we have Melissa Monosoff from the great state of Texas, very specifically from Dallas. Great to see you both. We'll give everybody a little bit more time. I love it when everyone tells us where they're coming from. I am dialing in from California, from San Mateo, where our head office is. And thank you for sharing where you are.
Oh, hey, Tim. It's nice to see you.
Oh, I love it. Tim is here too. Tim is in the house. So if you haven't already, I'm going to go through, this is the best part. Evan gets to do housekeeping and the rest of us just have to listen to housekeeping, and now I get to do it too. So I'm going to put on those big girl boots and do some housekeeping Evan style. If you haven't opened and poured your wines, you should, because it would be great for you to let those babies breathe. Today, we're only going to be doing wine number 1, wine number 3, wine number 4, and wine number 6. There's just so much for us to cover, so many speakers, and we are going to be joined by 3 lovely vintners from France. I think thankfully their harvest is over, so they may be breathing a sigh of relief as they join us today. Or maybe they're still harvesting, I don't know. We'll find out. But if you want to keep it completely blind, again, you do not need to peel off the label. And if you want to test yourself for the markers, you could leave them where it is. We have a Q&A. You can put in any questions you have in a Q&A. Don't be surprised if you put in a question in the chat and one person from my team throws it into the Q&A. We do have people making that transfer so that everything gets answered. And if you're chatting, we love it. Please make sure you select to everyone, because Andrea and I and Evan and Keith and Melissa and all panelists have had the benefit of seeing everybody's comments. But sometimes you say, I love this wine, and nobody else sees it but us. So make sure you select everyone. It's the default to send to only panelists. Recordings, of course, will be sent after this by Bitly, and surveys. Please complete your surveys. It's very critical that our sponsors hear what you think. If Keith does a really bad job, let us know, you know.
Yeah, wow. Keith.
Right? No, I'm kidding. Keith, I know you're going to knock it out of the park, but it wouldn't be
pressure.
Yeah, it wouldn't be right if I didn't make fun of you. But yeah, let us know, because it really helps us to see the engagement. It helps our sponsors to hear from you. And at the very bottom of that survey, if you want somebody to reach out to you because you like a particular wine, you have a choice to ask for a follow-up there as well. On to the next slide. For those of you who received the wine, wonderful. We hope that you enjoy it. If you didn't receive the wine, I am sorry. Sometimes people think that I get to decide who gets to be receiving wines and don't. I don't. Really, at the end of the day, it's first come, first serve. You're all very important. And sometimes we just run out of product. Because there are only so many kits made. So if you're here on this call, I promise you, you will learn lots and lots, even if you don't have the wines. But if you do have the wines, extra learning, extra brownie points, you can go to mtwwines.com. You can join the leaderboard. No, Evan does not need to see what your particular answers are. So today, very low risk. Only I will see them. And then if nothing else, if you are interested in the rationale for why a wine is what it is, you can also put in the kit number and asked to reveal wine profiles. The original wine's wine label is downloadable there. All the tasting notes that Evan and his team of panelists have tasted are also available there. So without further ado, who is joining us today? We have Aurélien, who will be joining us a little bit later. Fabulous photos here as well. Ghislaine will be joining us as well. They're already on the call, and we will just have them pop open their video. And of course, Pierre-Alexandre will be joining us. So we're very, very happy and honored to have our vintner guests. It's nothing better than to hear from you guys directly. So thank you so much for joining us. Keith, I'm going to pass the baton on to you and Melissa as well, and then I will be in the background.
All right. Well, Li-Meng, thank you so much, and welcome everyone. It's such a treat to be here presenting with Melissa and the team from Beaujolais, and it's just nice to see everyone via Zoom, and looking forward to next year actually seeing everyone in person. But let's dive into Beaujolais. And for me, this is one of those regions that always kind of just makes me smile. And it's one of those places where, we're starting right here with this shot of Moulin Avant. And a couple of years ago, I was on a wine junket, and we're actually dining at a winery at Moulin Avant and having just an incredible meal, amazing steak, sitting outside, barbecuing, drinking lots of Beaujolais, which I highly recommend. And it was just one of those moments where you've been on that wine junket long enough and you're like, I just need a little alone time. And it was like, there's a vineyard, and, call me a geek, but I like to actually walk out, see the vineyards and get that feel. And I'm walking through the vineyard, and all of a sudden I kind of just swerve to the right, and I look up, and there's the hill right there, and there's the Moulin Avant. And it was just one of those moments where the sun is setting, perfect amount of, buzz on. And it was, to me, I just kind of smiled, because it's like, wow, this is one of my flashcards coming to life. And it's so cool to be in those regions where it's like, you had that list of oh, what are the 10 crus of Beaujolais, and having to memorize it. But then to all of a sudden be walking through the vineyards and to have that just perfectly timed moment, sun setting, look over, there's the Moulin Avant. And it was, just magical. And to me, that's what Beaujolais is all about. It's about this just feeling of, I don't necessarily want to say the simpler things, but the purity of wine and people. And it's just such a charming place, charming wines, and let's dive into it. So the next slide, since we're calling this a holistic look at Beaujolais, and I like this definition, that it is, the idea that the whole is more than merely the sum of its parts. And that is what's kind of amazing to me about Beaujolais, is this region where you have lots of wine that is produced, and a lot of it that goes out is just Beaujolais, Beaujolais Nouveau, and now we're seeing trends in rosé, but then there's also the crus and Beaujolais Village, and then you can dive into the actual crus itself, and it's taken as a whole, it's amazing. But then when we dive into the parts, which we will, they're also equally fascinating as well. So it's one of those few appellations that is easy to understand in some sense from a consumer standpoint, but then when you really dive into it, it's like peeling back the onion. There's so many layers to it, and you can dive so deeply. And what is super cool is that you're doing it kind of through the prism of Gamay. So you kind of have this, almost reference point benchmark that you can access the different types of appellations, see the slight difference in, big soil types like clay, marl versus granite. Then you can start to talk about elevation of the vineyards. Then you can dive into, the specific types of granite or the schist elements. So it's just a really cool region that I'm happy that we get to spend kind of the next hour diving into. So let's go ahead into the next slide. All right, so for those of you not familiar, Beaujolais is just north of Lyon and just south of the Macon. So in some sense, very much the center of France. And it's an area that is really kind of a crossroads. And, you think about historically, and if you look at the map on the right, I love that you see down at the coast Marseille, and you have the Saône and the Rhone rivers that basically flow, well, the Rhone from Switzerland down south, and the Saône is well coming from the Alps side, but you can see the rivers flowing down to Marseille. So it made perfect sense that the Phoenicians and then the Romans, that when they were starting to expand their empires to explore, they just follow the river up. And you had that kind of ancient kind of history, trading back and forth, and kind of that exploration into the center of France was all that gateway. But then you also had all the people from the north trying to get down to the south, and with the Alps, the Massif Central, it really was the roadway to get to the south. So it was a really kind of cool confluence of just logistics, and then also too, it's right at the tipping point too of weather. And I came across one thing that I thought was great. They said the homes to the north of Beaujolais have pointed roofs, and the homes to the south of Beaujolais have flat roofs. And it's kind of that just perfect way to sum up, like, oh yeah, it's colder in the north, it's warmer in the south, but being right there on that precipice between the two. And then what else I really wanted to kind of point out on this map is you look at, and you see that Massif Central. That is one of the oldest set of mountains in all of Europe. And the Alps to the east are some of the newest mountains in all of Europe. So you have two very, very different soils. And the Alps, really, when they kind of pushed up, they lifted a lot of those ancient seabeds up, and it kind of formed the limestone bedrock that is so prevalent in Burgundy, Champagne, and kind of to the north. But the Massif Central are mostly that granite schist based that, really kind of forms that backbone of really old, mountains. We're talking millions of years older than the Alps. So even though it is close to Burgundy, in many ways, the soils are far closer to the Rhone than what you will see in, vineyards just literally, 10, 20 kilometers to the north. So, we geek out a lot about Alsace and all of its different soil types, but Beaujolais has almost every definable type of rock that we have found. And it's a tiny little area, but what's really cool then is then you can look at them all through the prism of Gamay. So it's just a really kind of fun, cool spot, and really kind of at a great crossroads in Europe. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so we touched on this a little bit, and we kind of talked about that antiquity where, yes, there were some native vines growing in the area, but it really took the Romans in particular, when they kind of established their empire and started to move their outposts further and further north and into France, that's when viticulture started to really take on kind of a commercial aspect, and also kind of a quality of life aspect as well. And they think maybe some of the first Roman vines were planted on Côte de Bruy. And then, we have a Julianassa later. So there's a city that they actually think was named after Julius Caesar. So you have a pretty darn long history of wine being produced in this area. And basically kind of got through the Middle Ages, and being at the crossroads, this was an area where there was a lot of turnover. There's the city of Beaujolais, and there was the Duke of Beaujolais, who kind of started kind of the first little kind of mini empire there in that area. But supposedly they like to battle quite a bit and would go back and forth, and couldn't quite establish a peaceful domain for vines to really thrive and for viticulture to kind of take off. And then you also had, at that same time in the Middle Ages, you kind of had, at the end of it, you start to see the establishment of the Abbey of Cluny up north in the Macon, and the power of the Benedictine monks, and kind of that expansion, and kind of the vineyard know-how and knowledge being passed down, that scientific method for the first time being applied to viticulture. So, it was one of those things that even back then they started to realize that Gamay could yield like crazy, and that on certain soils, they liked the wines far better. And even as early as 1395, there were decrees saying that it should be, not planted on limestone, because it can be kind of higher acidity, and limestone kind of exaggerates that. Whereas if you put it on an acidic soil like granite, they both kind of balance each other out, and it actually seems to make the wine not quite as tart or sour. So even as 1395, it was like, okay, the granite is where this grape shines. And then as you're kind of transitioning out of the Middle Ages, Lyon starts to become a bigger city, and Melissa will talk to you in a second. But as the growth of Lyon happens, I saw two different wine books mention this, and I kind of loved it. They said that three rivers flow into Lyon. You have the Saône River, the Rhone River, and the Beaujolais River. So I kind of love that. Yes, they drank a lot of it there, and they even had their own special bottle for it called the Pot. So I can't wait to set one day in Lyon and drink some Beaujolais out of a pot. So Melissa, what
Let's
you want to
go.
take us up to modern times?
Yeah, I'm ready to go. After tasting these wines and reviewing for this presentation today, I'm just ready to go to Beaujolais, really. But yeah, as you were saying with Lyon, really, well, most parts of Europe and many beverages across Europe, it really has to do with the advent of the railway system. And once the railway system was set up connecting Paris to Lyon, things just completely changed. That wine was able to get from Lyon up to Paris, and then also workers from Paris and other parts of France were able to come to Lyon, and Lyon became a major player in the industrial age of France. And so with the multitude of workers and the jobs and the people and the bistros, Beaujolais completely exploded in terms of how many people were drinking Beaujolais and how many people had access to the wine. So that's where we see kind of this complete explosion. People started to know about Beaujolais. It made its way to Paris, like I mentioned, the bistros there, and in Lyon. And it was very, very fashionable with the workers, very fashionable at the bistros, mainly because it was partially because it was very easy to drink, and it was from the area, but also it was just delicious and went perfectly with the food of the region as well, which is always super important. As we move into the 1900s and with the advent of the AOC system, as we see that Beaujolais and all of the crus and the different appellations of Beaujolais are some of the first to be in that first wave of AOCs to be codified. So right off the bat, you have all of the crus and the Beaujolais AOCs. So they were part of that first wave and codifying what it meant to be them in their terroir, which we'll talk about as we taste. But as you know, that kind of roller coaster after World War II and then into the 50s and 60s, it's been quite a roller coaster for the popularity of Beaujolais. And then we come to the 80s with the advent of the Beaujolais Nouveau, especially the Beaujolais Nouveau bottles, with advertising and marketing and de boeuf and the flower bottles, and just the explosion of the popularity of that wine, in particular here in the US and then across the globe. It just changed everything for Beaujolais in terms of what the perception of Beaujolais and how people viewed the area. But then we look to today, and that's the sommeliers or people in the wine business, and we know that it's a very interesting roller coaster, because today, when I think about Beaujolais, when I first got into the wine business, and thinking about those flower bottles, and then to discovering crus, and as Keith mentioned, kind of the flashcards and kind of understanding the flavors, to working in the restaurants. And you said earlier about Beaujolais makes you smile, and yes, like you can make guests smile, because sommeliers realize that these wines go so well with so many different types of food. And to today, where, I mean, I don't know about you, Keith, but here in Dallas, most of those great Beaujolais are allocated. Like, I can't get my hands on them because they are so popular these days. So it's kind of a very interesting roller coaster of where the popularity of which wines and how they are perceived in the market today. Keith, do you have anything more to say on kind of that history that we've seen over the last few decades?
I think you summed it up great. The only thing I would add is I think there's definitely kind of a little bit of a trend that I've seen the last kind of 10 years, particularly in the last 5, but there's so much youth and energy in the vignerons. And
Yes.
It's really exciting because, and it's interesting that you see a lot of like grandparents handing off to their grandchildren.
Children, right?
And it's nice to see that kind of youth happening and that energy and excitement, and which I think you'll dive into a little bit with the viticulture, but like with the way the vines are trained, a lot of it has to be hand harvested. A lot of it is hillside vineyards, and it's just nice to see this younger generation kind of embrace it and dive into trying to farm sustainably, a lot more organically, biodynamically. and this almost kind of, it's weird. It's almost, you have the big commercial Beaujolais itself, Nouveau, which I think is over half of the production. And then Beaujolais Village is a quarter of the production. And then you have the Cruise, which is a quarter. But it's just interesting that there is really this kind of push for super, super high quality, but then also super, super drinkable and accessible.
And that is a really good point, that sensibility change of what the priorities are, how we move into the next, into the future with sustainability and organics and with climate change and things like that. And the change in winemaking, the sensibilities of what's happening in the winemaking and also in the vineyard. True.
Yeah. So, all right, let's roll. I'm getting thirsty.
On the next slide. All right, so let's get to know Gamay a little bit better, what the grape is like, who it is. And you see here that 97% of the area that produces Beaujolais comes from the Gamay Noir Ajou Blanc. So that's the full name of the grape variety. About 3% of it is Chardonnay. And knowing that it is a cross between Pinot Noir and Gouais Blanc. So it is a cross. And as Keith was mentioning before, granite is the soil of choice, and that is completely for a reason. That natural exuberance, I like that word, the fact that Gamay is a high yielding grape, but because it's being planted in a low nutrient soil, and when you're planting it in low nutrient soil, like granite, that translates to lower fertility, and lower fertility translates to lower yields and hopefully more concentrated flavors, more minerality and more intensity in the flavor. And so planting in high granite soil content is kind of Mother Nature's way of kind of taming Gamay a bit. So those two things go hand in hand. And to me, that's like kind of the definition of terroir, that combination of place, that combination of the exact grape variety in that soil on the hillsides. And we'll talk about in nature doing its due diligence to kind of create this really special thing. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in terms of planting, we can talk about, you've seen the short Goldston style pruning. So the little plants, the single plants are like this big, they're so cute. And I always call them the old guys too. When you see the old vines, they're like really, really interesting and a very signature of the style. But when you see the larger productions, you'll see more mechanization, different types of training for that mechanization. And then also for the future, and for also when we talk about climate change and things like that, you're going to see the single cordon pruning is becoming a little bit more popular in that regard. So yeah, it's a lot of interesting confluences here, especially with being very proactive in the vineyard and very conscientious quality producers is where we see these really intensely flavored Gamay grapes, and don't have to think about it in terms of those larger productions or more simple wines.
Yeah, and Melissa, the only thing I'd add there is about the yields, because I found it kind of interesting when I was diving in and reading some of the producers' notes and interviews that, I mean, by law, Beaujolais itself is 55 hectoliters per hectare.
Right.
Beaujolais Village drops to 50, and then the Crus are 48.
48.
So, dramatically higher yields than, say, like a Grand Cru in Burgundy. But what was really fascinating is some of like the old guard and really some of the really respected producers, they said Gamay itself is happiest when it yields. Like there's a balance, and they said we've made 20 hectoliters, 20, 25 hectoliters per hectare, and the wines just kind of lost that happiness and smile. It was one of those things where they could do it, but they did, Marcel Lapierre was like, the best wine I ever made was actually 60 hectoliters per hectare.
There you go.
So it's just, I think it's one of those grapes that you find the balance for your vineyard, and you want that juicy mid palate fruitiness that is Gamay. So it was kind of interesting to read, like maybe low yields aren't necessarily the secret high quality the way it would be like in a Napa Cab or a Burgundian Pinot.
And what low yields means is all relative to the grape, to the vineyard, and to the producer, right? And so also what is happening in the vineyard, and that's why there's so many Liudis in the Crus, right? Because they're all so unique and offer different things, and what those Crus offer in terms of the soil and the terroir itself is different, right? And so, yeah, that's really interesting. I love that. That whatever makes sense, most sense to the grape variety itself, that low yields is relative to the place. Cool, let's go on to the next slide into harvest and vinification. All right, so when we talk about harvest and vinification, we are talking about manual harvesting because we want to keep those grapes or those clusters intact, but also mechanization on the Goldston training doesn't really make a lot of sense. Maybe you'll see that for the Beaujolais village, but not so much for the cruise or the training on the Goldston or the single cordon. But when we talk about and also the terroir of the hilly nature of the undulations of Beaujolais itself and on hillsides, not so great for tractors. But I do see that they are coming up with tractors. They are building tractors that can go on the hillsides. But I can see why this does not make sense for this region, but or at least for the cruise. But so when we talk about the vinification, we want to talk about the grapes either being destemmed and made in a traditional winemaking process. And Burgundian, some wines of Burgundy sometimes use stems and sometimes don't. But then one of the main things we want to talk about is the idea of carbonic maceration. And carbonic maceration is different than whole cluster fermentation, and we'll talk about why in a second. But when you're using whole bunches for fermentation, that's one thing. And then you're employing the idea or the method of carbonic maceration to produce unique flavors and aromas. So one is kind of part of the other, or is you use whole clusters in carbonic maceration. But the difference really is that idea of having the berries and the bunches intact. And what happens is entire clusters are put into a big tank and they are filled up, the tank or the vat is filled up to the top. And what happens is the grapes on the bottom of the tank begin to crush. And at the bottom of the tank, when the grapes crush, then the juice is obviously released, and then the natural yeast on the skins of the grape are like, party time, I got some food, right? Okay, so they see the sugars in the grapes and they automatically, they're like, yes, it's party time. Let me consume those sugars. And when they consume sugars, they ferment them into alcohol, of course, and then carbon dioxide. And so once that carbon dioxide begins to build up, that carbon dioxide actually pushes out some of the oxygen, or most of the oxygen, out of the tank. And normally what we're trying to do is release the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But here we're wanting to trap that carbon dioxide, and that tank is closed and maybe even filled up with a little bit more carbon dioxide. But the whole point is to create this toxic environment of a completely anaerobic, oxygen-free environment for the grapes that are still intact or in their whole clusters, that they begin to go through an anaerobic process. Is kind of, the word fermentation is interesting because it is a fermentation, but it's kind of a biochemical change inside of the actual berry. And what happens is the berry starts to consume its own sugars in that anaerobic environment, and then eventually they kind of die and split open because they really can't hold on to that toxic environment anymore, because once those sugars are converted into a little bit of alcohol, they really can't hold on to that toxic environment or the buildup of the carbon dioxide inside of the actual berry. So they split open and then releasing their juice into the tank. Now, along with that, so when that kind of intercellular transformation is happening, a lot of the color from the skins goes into the juice, and also a lot of those polyphenols. So all of those aromas and flavors and some tannin, not a lot of tannin, but go into the juice. And so when that berry kind of explodes, it then releases that intense fruity character and all those polyphenols and esters that are created inside there into the juice. And that's where we have kind of special that's completely different than other whole cluster fermentations. You're actively seeking to create that kind of anaerobic environment to create those aromas and flavors in the vat. Keith, do you have anything else you want to mention about that?
Well, to me, it really kind of sunk in when I thought of it as almost like the opposite of micro ox.
Yes.
You know, and like Michel Rolland sitting there going, microbilage. It's like, no oxygen.
No,
So
exactly. But I think it's funny because we think of it as like, well, what's old is new again. And I guess that's kind of the way with natural winemaking, because really back in the day, I mean, when I say back in the day, I mean like way back. I mean, do you really think that they were like pulling off every single berry off the cluster? Like, no, they didn't have machines to do that for you, and they weren't sitting there really doing that. And so of course they just threw everything into the pot and see what happens. And so that was something that naturally happened. And I really find it interesting. Louis Pasteur is quite a guy in the wine and beer world, to be fair. And he really kind of codified like what exactly was happening, because people didn't even really know. They're like, yeah, this is how we've always done it. And now it's interesting to see that turn from carbonic maceration, semi-carbonic maceration, whole cluster, and kind of that balance of creating that fruitiness, but then also the natural fermentation that occurs from yeast with the grape skins in the kind of normal fermentation way.
Yeah, and the only thing I would say is that you've kind of implied it, but there are so many options when you're making this. And I think that's one thing that we see a lot in Beaujolais is, you know, you have that, you know, people who are like destem a lot, you know, then there's some whole cluster a lot. And then how much carbonic, how little carbonic, you know, how fast the fermentation. You know, I read like typically Beaujolais Nouveau is kind of like a 4-day fermentation. Then the crus are more 10 days plus. So that's really kind of one thing that when you're going through tasting producers, find out those extra little layers, because these are all small little things that make a big impact.
It's their impact. It's their impact on the actual wine. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. I'm getting thirsty.
I know, I'm ready too. You want to talk about some appellations, and then we'll.
Yeah. You know, basically you have the Beaujolais appellation, and which I said earlier accounts for about 50% of the production, give or take on years. You know, that can go up a little bit up, a little bit down. It's kind of fun. It can be 3 colors, blanc, rosé, and rouge. Typically speaking, a lot of these vineyards are at the southern half, you know, basically kind of those granite slopes, those foothills of the Massif Central kind of fade out, and then you kind of drop into like the Saône River Valley, and you have these little hills that kind of roll all the way down to Lyon. And a lot of the Beaujolais appellation and wines labeled as this are coming out of that southern kind of, not quite as hilly, much more clay marl soils. And typically these make for those just really fun, juicy, ready to drink right away wines that you don't have to, you know, go into a dissertation to understand. It's like you just pop it, you drink it, you enjoy it. And, you know, I love kind of the new marketing thing that the team in Beaujolais came up with, is they call them festive Beaujolais. And I kind of love it. It's like, yeah, I absolutely just want to pop a cork, not have to think about it. And multiple wine writers, as I was researching for this, I love it that they said Beaujolais is not a wine that you sip, it is a wine that you drink. And, you know, Jancis Robin even said Beaujolais can be particularly gulpable. And for Jancis to be like, yes, gulp it. But these kind of just Beaujolais appellation is like the perfect epitome of that. And also it is a phenomenal gateway red wine. So if you have people who are major white wine drinkers, what's really kind of cool about Beaujolais Rouge is it has the, in almost in many ways, the structure of a red wine. I mean, structure of a white wine with kind of some red wine, very accessible, juicy berry fruit without the tannins that you get with a lot of other grapes. So it's a great way to introduce people to red wine and kind of get them enjoying it. Then you get to the Beaujolais Village appellation, which you have 39 villages that can label that. This is mostly kind of the area around the 10 crus, so the northern part. And these tend to be those pockets of more granite-based soils, a little bit more serious in terms of, you know, they kind of call them expressive Beaujolais. For me, it's like I call them the lunch Beaujolais. So like if you're out at a French bistro for lunch, absolutely can crush a carafe of Beaujolais Village. And for the price difference, it's amazing. Just the different kind of what's in the bottle, just how it goes from that just super crushable, festive to a little bit more, okay, cool, I can have this with some food, think a little bit more about it, a little bit more complexity, but still very accessible, very enjoyable. Blanc, rosé, and rouge as well. And then you have the 10 crus, which are almost completely up in those hills of those foothills and predominantly granite-based soils, and with a long history, like Melissa said, with some of them being shouted out now almost easily over 100 years ago and longer in some cases. So let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. And there's kind of a map kind of detailing it. So you can see that light green on the bottom, that would be where most of the Beaujolais vineyards are, and also kind of coincides with the stuff that's on the lower slopes in the north. And then that darker green would be your Beaujolais village up to the north, and then all the other colors would be your crus. And what's really interesting for me is if anyone's been to Napa, like just driving down Highway 29 Silverado Trail, how it's just everything is right there, super accessible, and it's just kind of like winery after winery after, like the Vegas Strip of wineries. And in some ways, when you're in Burgundy and you're in the Côte d'Or, it has very much that same feeling where like, oh, there's Beaujolais, and you just roll right through the villages. What I thought was really interesting when you get into the actual crus, they look close on the map, but they're much more kind of little valleys kind of tucked away and small little towns, windy, twisty roads. And to me, if Burgundy felt like Napa, this would be kind of like the Sonoma, where it just felt a little bit more spread out, a little bit more remote when you finally got to the village, and each one kind of stood on its own a little bit better. So a really fun place to visit and a great place to get lost. Let's go to the next slide. All right, Nouveau, the party.
I know.
You got it, Melissa.
So only, Beaujolais and Beaujolais Village can produce the AOC of Beaujolais Nouveau. So there's no such thing as like, Morgon, Cru, Beaujolais Nouveau. Okay, no, but know that there is both Rouge and Rosé of the Beaujolais Nouveau. And as we all know, here the third Thursday of November. And it is a 7-year-old tradition, but we got to think back to the fact that these are, seasonal wines, or the wines of the harvest wines. So this idea of the Fête de Beaujolais, Beaujolais Nouveau Day, and all of these festivals really date back to just the harvest, like a festival for the harvest, to drink the new wines, and that has been that forever, right? So now with the advent of advertising and George Buff and all of the beautiful or eye-catching bottles, we now have something that has been very popular here in the U.S. for the last few decades. But I love it. So let's keep going.
Yeah.
So we got to take some wine. Is there anything else you wanted to mention there?
Well, I was just going to say with Beaujolais Nouveau, it is absolutely my go-to for Thanksgiving.
Right.
And it's one of those wines that when you're getting together with friends or family, Thanksgiving itself is already so festive. And it's so kind of cool for me to be like, yes, here's the first wine of the year, from the Northern Hemisphere. And to be able to like sit down and enjoy it with Thanksgiving, with friends, with family. And also too, it's like one of the few wines that can hold up to anybody's cranberry sauce.
Absolutely. Definitely talk about some of that in the pairings, but I just love it that that it's just a great festival for people to enjoy the wine, enjoy the food, and the bistros de Leon and things like that. But I found it interesting. It's almost like pumpkin beer, like here in the U.S. They usually it's October, so yeah, we want to drink that, but every year it just keeps getting released a little earlier and earlier, and it used to be in December, and then they moved it back to when they first delineated the AOC. It used to be a December 15th date, but then they moved it back to in 1985 to the November date, because I think other people are just trying to go earlier and earlier and earlier to have that kind of heads up, the little leg up on the market, and then they're like, no, we're just going to change it to November. Love it. All right. You ready to taste some wine? So let's talk about some crus and then go into some tasting. So we have to talk about the crus. We talked about the major appellations. We talked about Beaujolais Nouveau, and we need to talk about the crus themselves. And yes, we have the 10 crus, and they all have their personality, slightly different. And it really has to do with the terroir, the slope, the soil, and the training of the vines, all of the things. And here are some great little descriptors that you can use to describe them and to kind of remember what they taste like. But honestly, really diving into the appellations and tasting them side by side and kind of getting to know the personality of the cru itself, I think is really cool. Plus, there's all the little Leodis in there too. So Saint-Amour, tender, bright, and juicy. We're going to taste the Julianas in a moment, but very fresh, animated, fleshy. I also like to think of, juicy as well. Chenath, smooth, shaped, and opulent. Moulin Avant, that kind of complex, powerful, solid, structured, age-worthy. Fleury, I like to think of it like F, like kind of fruity and a little bit floral. And then we got that beautiful church, Lamadon, there too, has a little bit more altitude. And we'll talk about Fleury a little bit too. Delightful, gentle, and elegant. Keith, you want to round out the next slide of Cruz?
Yeah, absolutely. Cherouble, expressive, rich, lively, and also kind of the highest base elevation. So when some people will say it's one of the lightest ones, and I think a big part of that is because of the elevation.
Yeah.
Morgon, a lot of vineyards planted here, and there's kind of the, we'll talk a little bit more about Morgon later because we got a wine from there, but definitely always considered dense, forceful, and I love too that it is a noun and it's considered a verb. And they say that it's one of the few Beaujolais that it needs to Morgon, and what that means is have a couple years in bottle, and then the fruit kind of comes out, that they can be kind of dense and forceful when they're young, but then they kind of round out and get really kind of pretty red cherry, almost, elegant with age, and can go quite a long time. Renier, bright, bold, defined, the newest of the crus. This one I think was in the late 80s that it got elevated. And what's kind of interesting is there's a couple right now that are also in pending or have in applications to try to get elevated as well. So who knows, maybe we'll have 11 crus. And then you have Bruy, which kind of are the vineyards around Côte de Bruy, which is the mountain. And both Côte de Bruy get up higher in the slope, a little bit bigger, richer, concentrated, but not to a Morgon or Moulin Avant level of richness or density. And then Bruy, very much I'd kind of put in the Fleury, Fleury, Saint-Amour, really juicy, delicious, super smooth and yummy. All right, let's get into wine number one.
If you haven't already, there's been a lot of chatter in the chat about wine number one. Some people very excited and have never seen white Beaujolais before. So Aurélien, I'm excited to hear you talk about it.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Aurélien Fiardet, so I'm the brand ambassador of Terroir Original, which is a collective of independent growers from Beaujolais that started in 1997. Sorry, and today I will talk about the first wine, which is Domaine Fellow, and the wine number 3, Domaine Fabien Collonges. So both producers belong to the same consortium in Beaujolais. Hi, Keith and Melissa.
Hello.
Hello. So yeah, it's very interesting to start with a white, and it's not very common to see a Chardonnay in Beaujolais. Because you represent only 3% still of the plantation. All the rest is Gamay mostly, and there's a kind of a special signature, for the Beaujolais blanc, because a lot of them are aged, without oak, which make a big difference with the standard, Chardonnay made in Burgundy, aged in oak barrel, from California, with some malolactic fermentation, always happening in barrel. So that's a big difference. So the Domaine Fellow is pretty old. It started in 1829. So it's like a 6th generation estate. It's based in southern Beaujolais in an area called the Pierre Doré, which is very specific and due to the terroir composed of limestone. It's like a golden limestone. So it's from the Jurassic. It was like a seabed before. So it's the same terroir basically as Burgundy or the Mâconnais from the Jurassic as well. So it's a lot of minerality, and I think there is almost like 50%, you know, of active chalk in the terroir of limestone. So it brings you know, this gunpowder minerality and zippiness to the Chardonnay in this area. We mostly find Chardonnay in the south of Beaujolais, but also in the north, nearby Saint-Amour, close to Mâcon, because we have pretty much the same terroir with more limestone, but also along the Saône River on the east side of Beaujolais, outside of the Cru, where we have a deeper soil with more alluvial. It's a better terroir for Chardonnay as well. So Manu Fellow planted that in early 2000. So it's like 25 on average year-old Chardonnay. Not a lot, he only owns barely an hectare and a half. So it's very small production. And that's the thing about Beaujolais Blanc. It's always a smaller production because it's very spread out, and producer only own sometimes 2 or 3 hectares of Chardonnay each. So it's very hard to find. And Manu prefer to do winemaking for this Beaujolais Blanc in stainless steel. So it's manually harvest. It doesn't use any machine. So all picked by hand, which is a big difference, you know, with some producer in Mâconnais, where 60% is harvested by a machine. So big difference in terms of quality. And then it's pressed directly with a pneumatic press, and then fermented at low temperature, so just above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, because you don't want the alcoholic fermentation stop. But you keep it cold enough, so between 60 and 70 on fine lees. So it does like a cold settling to ripe the gross lees, and only keep the fine lees after for the malolactic fermentation happening either in stainless steel or in cement. And then it's bottled in the spring, pretty early, you know, to keep it fresh. So in April, just after a very light filtration. And the style, you know, is very typical of the variety of the Chardonnay, I think, with a lot of white flower, a little bit of green apple, some pear, a lot of citrus, some almonds, a little bit of nuts. So very typical of the Chardonnay when it's not aged in barrel, you know. And depending on the vintage, you know, of course, sometimes it's going to be a little riper with lower yield. So he has a little more, you know, riper fruit notes. But when that happened, Manu tried to keep a good balance by doing, for example, a partial malolactic fermentation to keep some higher malic acid, you know, in the final blend that allow to keep some acid, you know. And it happened a lot the past few vintage where the Chardonnay was, you know, pretty ripe because of, you know, the higher temperature during the summer in France here the past few vintage.
I got a question. Oh, I was going to say, I've got a quick question because I see 210 case production. How much of that actually makes it to the US?
We don't sell a lot in the US. I know we sell in California about 100 case a year, and little bits in Wisconsin as well. And that's pretty much, I think.
Wow.
Yeah, because I always love that at a table when you're like, there's only 100 cases of this in the US, and people are like, oh my gosh, I need to try that. So
it is imported into the US for sure. Aurelia, I'm just going to jump in here because I want to be mindful, since you have to leave at 11:30. I want to throw out a question that I think will be best thrown at you. Does this the AOC law specify that it's 100% Chardonnay that needs to be in Beaujolais Blanc? Is there such a sort of law?
Yeah. That's a law. It's always 100% Chardonnay. If you put any other varietal, I know some producers making, for example, Gamay Blanc with the direct pressing of the Gamay without color. It's declassified to Vin de France. So I don't think you're allowed to add any percentage, of other varietal in the Beaujolais Blanc. Mhm.
Great.
And actually, I'm sorry, Li Meng, but that's like a great segue, because there was a question, the Gamay Noir au jus blanc, that there is actually a Gamay Noir au jus rouge. So,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
but the vast majority of the plantings are the one with the clear juice.
Yeah, there's some Gamay Blanc too, but it's very hard to find. Sometimes you can find a few raw, or Gamay Gris also, like the Pinot Noir, Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris. But the most common is the Gamay Noir Jus Blanc in Beaujolais.
Mm-hmm. And one question before we move on, in the chat at the very beginning, TC, for instance, brought it up. You have a lineup of 6 wines from Beaujolais. It was a surprise to see one wine number 1, as a Blanc. So my question for you is, why is it important to your winery for producing a Blanc? Clearly not done, given how small the percentage is.
I think it's always good for a producer, to have a diversified range. Even more when you sell your wine, you are more attractive. If you have a white, if you have a rosé. So Manufado makes some rosé too, beside the red, and it's always good, in your portfolio and as a winery to be able to offer a few options. Some producer make sparkling too, with a Gamay, and Chardonnay too. They're great grapes for sparkling. So I think it's very useful, to be able to offer some whites. And even producer I know make white with Gamay, so they press directly without skin contact. They don't have any Chardonnay yet. That allow them to have a white wine to offer.
Great. One last question before we move on, because it just came out from James Melendez. Thank you, James, for that question. Why is there so little Chardonnay produced? I mean, overall in Beaujolais, it's obviously a delicious wine. What is your perspective on other people and the region? Why so little?
So I think it's due to the terroir. That's the main reason, because the biggest pocket is the granite, in Beaujolais, in northern Beaujolais. So the Gamay is better. The Chardonnay would be too acidic, too lean, on the granite, because the soil is too poor. So that's the main reason. And I think Chardonnay was probably more planted before, and it was more popular. But due to the success of the Beaujolais Nouveau, I think some farmers planted more Gamay and pull out some Chardonnay, and now it's kind of the reverse. In some terroir, we start to see more Chardonnay, especially in the south with the limestone. We see more and more Chardonnay, some Pinot Noir also are coming up to kind of compensate, the decreased demand on the Beaujolais Nouveau.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and would you say also too, maybe a little bit is up in the north, like in Saint-Amour, some of the vineyards there can actually be sold as Macon, or like, or then Saint Veron, like if it's actually Rouge and Gamay, it can be sold as Beaujolais, but if it's Chardonnay, it can be sold as Saint Veron. So at least from what I read, it sounds like there's a little bit more Chardonnay at that very northern tip, but some actually gets labeled on different appellation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, due to the terroir too. Even in the south, where Manufado is, he can claim the appellation Bourgogne Blanc if he wants. The same for the Pinot Noir, but there's a big fight happening in the past few years, conflict between Bourgogne and Beaujolais about the designation of the appellation. But it's an option for Chardonnay. You can claim it as a Bourgogne Blanc too, if you want.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much. We'll invite you back on camera again with wine number 3 when you're ready to present that.
Okay.
Keith, back to you.
Yeah, so the wine number 2, we're just going to talk a little bit about rosé. And I am so excited and happy about this category because I remember, as the Somosaurus on the panel here, I remember the days of like when we'd have rosés on the wine list and you'd have it by the glass for spring and summer. And you're like, whoa, I got to get rid of my rosé pour. And oddly enough, a lot of times I'd switch my rosé pour for a Beaujolais pour to get me through fall. but I love that the US is now embracing dry rosés, and I'm now keeping them on the wine list year round by the glass, and they're selling year round. And I just think this is a really exciting category for Beaujolais because, you know, if you look at that wines that were going to just straight Beaujolais or Beaujolais Nouveau, a lot of them could go to rosé, probably get a higher price point, and I think be absolutely delicious.
Yep.
So I think here in the US, we're going to see them just continue to sell well because Beaujolais's got great renown within the US. It's a name people know and they like. And it's like, you think of Beaujolais, it makes you smile. But hey, have you had a rosé? No, I haven't. Oh my gosh, I probably should. So, Melissa, do you want to add anything?
Yeah. Oh, Melissa, go for it.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Li-Meng. What were you gonna say? I'm excited about this too because it just seems like a natural thing to, as Aurélien was saying, and the kind of lineup of Beaujolais and that diversification of your lineup. I think it's it's perfect with food and year round, and yeah, I think it's gonna be it's a home run.
I have the pleasure of introducing Ghislaine. I'm so excited to have our producer here. And this is a wonderful product that's imported here into the US by Kermit Lynch. You know, a lot of times when we show wines here at BevCon, for us, it's so important to be showing products that can be purchased. And it is, you know, I remember being in New York showing another region not to be named, and Paul Greco from Terroir coming up to me and goes, Li-Meng, I don't want to go to a table where the wines cannot be found in New York City. So I just want to make sure that we say that this wine is widely available. There is a reason why we're not tasting this wine today. I know there's a lot of chatter on the chat right now, and it's important for me to say this. Ghislaine's going to explain her winemaking process, which I'm very excited to hear about. This particular winery used very low sulfites during their bottling. And this way of winemaking, obviously, as you guys know, is a great way to preserve the fruit. It's a great way to really taste what this terroir is all about. It does make the wine a lot more fragile than it's intended for a process like our process where we rebottle. So we do encourage folks to try rosés and to try this producer's wine specifically out of 750. And if you are tasting it, if you would do me the respect and favor of trying the wines, but we want to make sure that, you know, this is not fair for every single bottle, even in 750, where it is as the winemaker intended from a 750 bottle. So if there is variation, it's only fair that this wine is talked about in generality as opposed to what's happening in your specific bottle. And with that, I want to introduce and welcome Ghislaine. She's already on video. Welcome.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. So just to present me, so I'm Ghislaine Dupeuble, and my family is a family winemaker since 1512, so more than 500 years ago. And we are located in the south of Beaujolais, in the famous place of Pierre Doré, like Aurélien have explained before. And on my vineyard, I work with my brother, Stefan, and together we produce, so the property is 100 hectares and we produce 43 hectares of wine. So it's about 25,000 cases per year. It's about 16,000 cases for red Beaujolais, 3,600 cases for the white, and less than 5,000 cases for the rosé. And for the US market, it's about 40% of the 40% of the production of the rosé. And so the particularity of the vineyard is that we work, our philosophy is to work like a partnership with the nature. So we are not in biodynamic, we are not we are nature. We used to work less and less product, but sometimes we need to use. But the particularity is to have a natural wine, not for the culture, but for the vinification. So that's why today you can't have my wine, because I don't use sulfur for the vinification and I don't use sulfur for the bottling. And bottling again a bottle, it's not possible because it crashes the wine. And so I'm sorry, you can't test my wine, but please buy one bottle and test with some people, some friends, some family, and you will have a very beautiful time with your people, with the people that you love. And I'm sure you will appreciate it. So my vineyard is HVE, high value environmental. So it's an agreement for the nature, for the partnership with the nature. And for the rosé, so it's 100% Gamay, of course. I use a young part of the vineyard, less than 10 years old. And for the soil, we have sand and siliceous. And so it's a wine press. So the grape come on the vineyard. We take it in a tank and we wait about 5 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours or 10 hours before to press it, just to obtain the color. And then we press all the tank. So we control regularly with my brother the color. And when we obtain the color that we want, so very girly, very pink, so we make the choose to press the grape. And after that, we make a very slow fermenting process with cold temperature. We make batonnage too. And when the alcoholic fermentation is finished, we also make 100% of malolactic fermentation. And the wine is just slowly aging in tank before to bottling about 2 months. And we quickly bottling because you want to have very, very fast in the year for the spring rosé in the US market, because of the rosé, of the sun, because of the barbecue party, because of very good time with people that you like. So it's a wine that we make time to produce for the fermenting process. But after the fermenting is finished, we have very short time to take it in the bottle, to bottling it, and to ship it to the US market. But I think you enjoy with it.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
I've got a question before she goes, though, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Well, I have a comment and a question. Like, I just want to say that my glass is drinking delicious, and I have not been spitting it because it is delicious.
Likewise, likewise.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say thank you on that. And then also your family's wines. I know that for me, it's always been one of my favorite nouveaux. And I was just wondering if you could speak of how difficult is it going to be with the supply chain, the shipping issues. Are we going to get our normal Beaujolais Nouveau this year, or?
For me, for the rosé, it's the same process as for the Beaujolais Nouveau. It's very fast between the bottling, the time of the bottling, and between the time that you want to have to test it, to drink it at the US market. It's very short. It's the same stress than for the Beaujolais Nouveau. But for the Beaujolais Nouveau, we have the stress to make the fermenting process, to finish everything, and that the wine will be good. But
Great. And
it will be good for this year, but with the COVID time, it's difficult to obtain for the shipment. So the boat is late, and you will have the Beaujolais Nouveau for Christmas. And I'm sorry, you can't make the party with the Beaujolais Nouveau at the time of Beaujolais Nouveau, but you have some rosé more in the US market, so you can make with the rosé. It's a wine very fruity. It's a wine very easy to drink. It's a wine. It's the same things of the than the Beaujolais Nouveau. Sorry. So with less color, with less alcohol, but the same idea. And I hope there will be a lot of sun for the time of Beaujolais Nouveau time for this.
And in the chat, I just want to put this out there for everybody. There is a question here. I love this wine from Sheena that she wants to put it on her wine list. Of course, Ghislaine is not going to have any issues with you wanting to put it on your wine list. If you're in California, Sheena, that I see here, it is available with Kermit Lynch, and I believe they have this available. Ghislaine, what is the current vintage that you have in the US right now? Is it?
For the rosé, it's 2020.
2020. Wonderful. Yeah. So the 2020 is available, and you can definitely get it from Kermit. And for those of you who did break my rule and tasted it anyways, I'm so glad that you love it. But as Ghislaine has said, we would love for you to taste the 750. I had the pleasure of being on the production line the day that this was being bottled. And I can tell you this, Becky will be my judge and witness. We were having a wonderful bottling day that day. So it was a gorgeous, gorgeous wine, and it showed so many beautiful flavors. So with that, Ghislaine, thank you very much. Keith, onward and forward.
All right. Beaujolais and Beaujolais Village. We've kind of talked about that, so let's just get right into the wine.
Yeah.
Up and
there we go.
We talked about the soil, so boom. Yeah, let's go right into the wine. So wine 3 is from Chirouble, and kind of as I mentioned, a little bit highest elevation of the cruise. And I love that they have, if you've been to France, every town square, there's usually like a statue. And I love that they've got maybe the most fitting French wine statue in the world. It's not Napoleon. Yeah, been there, done that, seen that. It's actually Victor Pouliot, who is one of the guys who basically figured out the grafting of American rootstocks to save us from phylloxera. So I love that is in the village town square there. And Aurélien, if you want to go ahead and take us through the wine.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So this wine is made by Fabien Collonges. He's a young producer, early 40s, that started the estate in 1997. He has about 12 hectares. They specialize in Chirouble, and he has a little bit of Beaujolais Village and Morgon too on the outskirts of Chirouble. So as I was saying, Keith is the highest, appellation in Beaujolais, which make it a very steep vineyard, beautiful site to look. You can have like a very nice lookout, from the top of Chirouble in a place called the Terrace, where you can watch, the White Peak when the sky is very clear. So it's a magical place, but very hard to farm because of the steepness of the soil. You can barely use, a tractor to go walk in your vineyard. So the cost, of production and of farming, it's pretty high in Chirouble, but he make it also magical because of the difference of temperature, day and night, the exposure, and the soil composed of pink granite with some crystal. It's one of the typical soil that you can find in Beaujolais. It's a granite we call the granite of Fleury of Odena. So it's pink color, and it's very crystalline, very thin soil and pore. So to me, it's one of the best fit for Gamay, able to produce a very expressive, aromatic, elegant Gamay. We almost find, the quintessence of Gamay in this terroir. When I do, a lot of tasting, and when you do a blind tasting, Chirouble is always one of the cru coming first, because it's very expressive, very feminine, and very elegant expression of the Gamay on this terroir. I saw some people were commenting, that it remind them some Cornas, some Northern Rhone wine. Here we go again, the comparison with the terroir of Northern Rhone, very steep, high terroir composed of granite. And the vintage 19 was a warm vintage too. So the Gamay is very versatile, and some years Gamay seems to tend more like Pinot Noir. and some years, Gamay seems to tend more towards Syrah because of the sun, the ripeness, the color is darker, the skin of the grape is thicker. We have more peppery notes, darker fruits, reminding of the note of the Syrah, and some spiciness too that we can characterize Gamay with some licorice note and black peppercorn. So very typical on a warmer year. So Fabien Collonges does manual harvest too, because in Beaujolais, in the cru, you are not allowed to use a machine. It's one of the, only 2 AOC in France, with Champagne imposing the manual harvesting. Very important to know in terms of quality of the fruits. And the reason is it's because we want to vinify with whole cluster. If you use a machine, you systematically destem the grapes. And for the carbonic fermentation process, so the semi-carbonic fermentation process, we want to make sure to vinify with the stem. The stem will bring more backbones to the wine, unique profile to the wine, some capacity to age. It will also balance, the pH with the release of potassium during the fermentation. And the soil of Beaujolais, is very acidic. Very low pH, so the fact to ferment with a stem allow to balance that out. And it does a very traditional fermentation, in cement cubic vat that we can find a lot in Beaujolais, with the whole cluster about 7 days on the skin. So very traditional fermentation. So we call it semi-carbonic. And then the wine is pressed and aged on fine lees in cement again with the malolactic before being filtered and bottled late spring or early summer. And this wine comes from a lieu-dit called Côte Rôtie. So it's not a hazard, the comparison with the Syrah and the Northern Rhone appellation. So there's a Côte Rôtie vineyard and a Grosse Pierre vineyards. It's only 1.5 hectares, so very small production again, about 335 cases a year. You can find this wine in New York. It's distributed by Peachy in New York, but also in other states, about 10 states, in the US.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know if it's just with the name of the vineyard being Côte Rôtie, but it's so peppery and granity, and I mean, it's to me, it's kind of fun. It's like if I had a Syrah from the Rhone without the dead animal, without the bloody meatiness, and it's just like it's all blackberries and pepper and spice and granite. Absolutely delicious. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Melissa, you got anything on this?
No, it's really all the things that you said with, I mean, that richness, its personality, and I'm just so intrigued by the appellation itself and getting to know this pink soil, granite soil, and its effect on the wines. But yeah, I find it to be really expressive, and that black pepper was something new for me to enjoy and think of it in that way that you were mentioning in the relation to Syrah or Northern Rhone Syrah. So that's a really cool thing.
Yeah, and this is another thing that I just kind of love about Beaujolais Cru is to get this type of complexity and personality in a wine at this price point is really kind of fun and cool and unique. And especially if you've seen so much of the New World kind of go to this overripe, I don't know what grape it is, jammy fruit, alcohol, oak bomb. It's nice to actually have a wine that has a sense of place, a sense of personality, and restraint. So I'm really looking forward to the next 3 wines. And with that,
let's do it.
Yeah, but here's just a shot of the beautiful hillsides there. So as you look out over the valley, and then let's go ahead and go to the next side. So with the crus that we're tasting, it was kind of fun. The Beaujolais site had some pretty amazing maps. And the orange and red soil types are granite based. So a lot of people talk about this being the most granite heavy of the crus, and here is basically proof of that. So kind of keep this in context, especially as we go into the next few wines where you can see the variations in soil. But I love here that it's just basically all orange and pinkish orange and red. All right, next slide. All right, Melissa, do you want to start us off on number 4?
Sure, let's pick up glass number 4 and talk a little bit about Julianas. And I think this is such an interesting cru, one for the name alone, but also the fact that it is an actual town and people live in Julianas. But the growers believe that this was the site of the first vineyards that were planted in Beaujolais by the Romans during the conquest of Gaul. So we talked about that a little bit earlier. I mean, I guess history is, well, that's what they believe, right? So that's what they call it, Julianas. And so, name for Julius Caesar. So when we think about that, if grapes have been grown for nearly 2,000 years there, dating back to when they were planted in the 100s. And so it's been a really long time and a lot of care and a lot of evolution of the vineyards. And when you look at the terroir of the area, it slopes down toward the river. And there's kind of varying altitudes of where the grapes are planted, depending on the lieu-dit. And then also the soils really vary. The soils can be anything from granite to blue sandstone to alluvial soils that go down toward the river. So that's why there's a lot of variability in Julianas. So here you see that the geography can be those higher altitude hillsides, but they can also be a little bit closer to the river and the more alluvial soils. This wine here is made by Michel et Sylvain Tet Domaine de Clos de Fief Tradition. And so this is a long name for such a delicious wine. 100% whole cluster. And we talked about what that means. They're using all of it is whole cluster, semi-carbonic vinification, using indigenous yeast and aged in cement. So all of those things have a high impact on the flavor of the wine. And this is made by the 4th generation crew, run by the father and son team. All right, so let's smell the wine and give it a little taste and see what we have. And when we think about some of those descriptors of the crus, sometimes you can just kind of throw that out the door, and because you find some new things. For instance, like with Cherub, I was thinking, I had this idea, and now I have a whole new repertoire of descriptors. So every wine can be different. And here, I mean, yes, I like to talk about fruity and floral and fleshy, and robust and structured. But then when we think about this red fruit and strawberry and violet and that little bit of cinnamon there too, red currant. Put into the chat some of the flavors and aromas that you get as well. But I think those are the things that really jump out of the glass to me. And I really love the floral fruity character here. So when we taste it, so we have that floral fruity character up front, then when we get it on the palate, let's notice the difference and see kind of what we find on the palate in terms of tannin structure and the fruity character too, and noting that how the wine was made with that 100% whole cluster and that semi-carbonic.
Yeah, and it's just so incredibly grapey. And
there you go.
And I love that. For a beverage that's made from grapes, we almost never use that as a descriptor. Yes. But it seems to me like the younger, the fresher the wine is, the more it actually tastes like grapes. But it's like, this actually is like grape would be, if we were gritting the wine, it almost like, I'd be like, there should be a point for grape. Like,
yes, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. I love how round and kind of fleshy it is too. And I think that's perfect. That's a great descriptor. But I love how fruity and strawberry it is on the nose, but then how grapey it is on the palate. I think we'll put into the chat here, a little bit of that earthy character too. And I do get some of that minerality, but it is intensely fruity and fleshy and just really, really delicious. So any other comments you want to make on that one? Yes, thank you. Let's look at that vineyard, how you can tell that over near the town, it's a little more flat, and then you can have those higher elevations. There's many different soils, as we talked about, with blue stone actually being the majority. And here you have the soil map here. Only really 3% of the area is granite. So that's why we find a little bit more of those fleshy tones to the fruit, not only how it was made in the winery, but also having to do with what's happening in the vineyard as well.
Yeah, and just so everyone, those kind of bluish green colors, those are more the schist based soils to kind of keep everything. And then the grayish ones are more the alluvial.
I don't think I've ever seen a region give such comprehensive maps. You know, it is just quite remarkable how much detail that goes into these. And Andrea, if you go back one slide, I love the fact that the pictures are really showcasing what Keith was talking about, that discovery aspect as you go from one pocket, one village to the other, because just between the villages, it's just a ton of vineyards.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one thing I wanted to mention, you know, especially when you look at that map that we're currently looking at, and you see the river there, the river has a huge impact on the ripeness of the grapes too, because here these grapes are in a kind of an amphitheater, kind of directly on the river. So just like in Riesling in Germany, like that reflection of the light, the warmth from the river reflecting back up onto the vineyards, creating more ripeness and more intensity in the fruit, and some of that more fleshy, kind of robust, structured tones that we're getting.
Yeah. Wonderful. We're coming up against the end of the 90 minutes. So this is why I was saying that, oh my gosh, we have so much to cover with 6 wines. And we have one more speaker on the end there.
Yes.
So please stay with us. A quick note on wine number 5, the reason why we're not tasting it as a whole. And I asked Melissa and Keith to taste it because some of you did taste it. So I want to make sure that we can get some of their thoughts on it. But a couple of notes from our production side of things. For Shiraz, we just feel that given the style of winemaking and the release year of 2018, this is a 2016 vintage. And realistically, you know, given that we're in 2021, we just felt like there's a lot of bottle variation. And as such, it's only fair to the winery and the audience to enjoy a bottle of this wine on your own. So instead of saying one size fits all, but there were some comments made about this. So I just wanted to see if Keith, Melissa, you had some feedback also as you taste this wine.
Yeah, I mean, as I'm tasting it, I mean, it tastes like a 5-year-old Beaujolais. I mean, it's definitely showing some signs of age, but I kind of, oddly enough, like it. There's still some nice ripe fruit on the mid palate, but I definitely don't think I would cellar it much longer. And I thought it was interesting in one of the notes from one of the books I was researching. Someone said that there are wines of Beaujolais that will outlive a dog. And I'm just like, that is such an odd, weird, random way to look at time. And basically their point was like Moulin Avant, which is basically the other side of the valley from Chinas, is more famous for those wines that will live, past the 10-year phase. And then there are some of the crus where they're best within that, 3 to 7 year window. And this, I've had this one. I've actually had it on a wine list before. And when it's a little bit more fresh and vibrant, it's delicious.
Mm-hmm. And I love the comments from Cara Patricia. Thank you for sharing that. They have the 2019 in their restaurant. So this is really great. Melissa, just on the region itself, what kind of styles do you expect from Shiraz,
Yeah, so I think when we're looking at Chinas, we're looking at kind of, the richer, a little bit darker fruits too. Here I'm getting a lot of more of those earthy tones as well. So I think, when we talk about how we would describe it, I feel like, with this wine, I would be describing it in different ways than I would have been describing, the first descriptors that we gave. But yes, a little bit more on the darker fruits, elegant, what other ways, smooth. Here I'm finding a little bit more of that kind of like opulent fruit too, when it's more youthful. So those are some of the things that I look for with.
Wonderful. All right, so we have time for Pierre Alexandre. I'm so excited. Oh, I love this picture. Going to Pierre.
Hello, I'm Pierre Alexandre, I'm Domaine de Colette. I'm the son of Jackie and Evelyn Gauthier. I just come back in the estate, that is 2 years ago now. This is a family estate. I'm the fourth generation of the estate. We have 18 hectares in 5 appellations: Beaujolais Village, Morgon, Régnier, Fleury, and Moulin-à-Vent. We start organic certification in 2020 because when I come back. And tonight you test Morgon Champ de Colette. And you know Morgon is divided on 6 climates. And this is one climate of Morgon, Champ. The soil is very typical on Champ, on the climate Les Champs. There is some pink granite on the top and some schist and some glacial moraine on the bottom. This cuvée is from the single parcel, really old parcel, 80 years old. We produce a really small production on this cuvée. It's 30 hectoliters by hectares. And for produce this one, is not in organic fermentation. It's not in is not on semi-carbonic fermentation because we distem 60% of grapes. We distem the grapes for produce more strong wine and more fat and more full wine. And this one is very typical on the estates, and the same during the maceration and during the fermenting. During fermenting, it's very strange because this wine smells cherry and the color is really dark, more than other wine. And after fermenting during the ages in concrete vat, the wine tastes a little bit close. You want 1 to 2 years for opening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Keith, you want to make sure that
I'm just drinking and
Yes.
enjoying this. Like it's so yummy. Thank you, Pierre. Delicious wine. And also too, I love to me because it tastes like when I think of Morgon and when we teach about Morgon, and just having that extra little bit of oomph, and the fact that it's a 2018, in some ways it almost tastes younger than some of the wines that we've had before it. I feel like this could live longer, and and also to the weight of it, from like a sommelier working on a floor on a restaurant, it's like the perfect weight. You know, it's like Goldilocks. It's like not too light, not too heavy. It's just a perfect medium bodied red wine. And also too, the tannins are so silky, so refined that I feel like I could recommend this to anyone to pair with just about anything. Melissa, what are you getting out of the glass?
Yeah, a lot of those darker fruits too. Last night I opened these bottles to kind of give them some air. I had to kind of hide them from myself so I could save some for today, but I decided to taste the 4 reds blind, right? So I didn't open them, and I was like, okay, let me see if I can actually figure out what they, if I can get close to what they are. Thankfully, I only had 4. But yeah, the Morgon, I was like, oh yeah, that's Morgon, right? Because of the structure, the darker fruit, the richer character, but still just as you said, just perfect with so much. Just think of so many things I would want to eat with this, enjoy with this wine. So yeah, the softer plush tannins, the plum, the strawberry, all the things.
Yeah, and I just saw that in the chat that someone threw in that maybe there's tasted a little over the hill, and if so, I'm sorry about that. But I think to me this is almost more, when I talk about it tasting young, I feel like it's just tight, and I feel like a lot of that fruit is going to open up. Especially, this would be fun. Like I would love to just kind of maybe leave it in the glass, come back like in a few hours and see what it does in the glass. But I feel like there's a lot of potential of the fruit and all that to kind of open up, with some bottle age or time in the glass, time in a decanter. Pierre-Alexandre, I do have a question because I know Morgon is famous for the Côte de Pie with the rotten rocks, and then you have the other part of Morgon. With your family and working in the village, in the crew, do you see a difference in the soils? Is it, how would you, talk about the two different kind of terroirs of Morgon?
It's really different because we have, for example, Renier and Fleury on Pinguani, and we produce some really fruity wine, some red fruit. And for Morgon, it's on the Climat Léchard, and the soil is a bit more schist and less granite, and we produce some more strong wine, more dark fruit. There is a little bit more tannin, and it's more easy to produce really, a little bit more strong wine than granite, for example.
Fantastic. Uh-oh, I think Li Meng's jumping in. Like, are we up against the time?
Yes.
Is it like the NBA game where like 2 minutes, you have 2 minutes till halftime?
Shot clock is on.
Oh, she's on mute. You're on mute.
I like Will's comment in the chat, drinking this with ropa vieja, the Cuban beef dish made with flank steak, cumin, and cayenne pepper.
Yes, please.
Mm-hmm.
Melissa, do you want to let's take it home with the final slide here, the spirit of Beaujolais, and what's the spirit of Beaujolais for you?
For me, I think it's the sharing of obviously food and drink together at a table. But for me, the spirit of Beaujolais also is, I love trying Beaujolais with different cuisines. And if you know me at all, I spend time in South Korea a lot. And so I'm always trying to find wines to go with Korean cuisine. And that's kind of like my thing, like always trying to find the perfect pairings with different things. And that spirit of Beaujolais is that, like, no matter what Beaujolais I break out, it seems to work with whatever Korean dish I throw it at it. And what I love about Korean barbecue is the idea of sharing. You share everything in dishes. And so it's the sharing of the food, it's the sharing of the drink, and then of the Beaujolais itself. And sometimes I go a little too far, because one of my favorite pairings I've ever had recently was I had kimchi jang, which is the kimchi pancake. And I was like, yeah, let me try this brulee with this kimchi pancake. And I ended up eating like almost all of the pancake, which is meant for like 4 people, and drinking half the bottle because it was just such a delicious pairing together. And it just, the food and the wine and the food and the wine. And next thing you know, you're like, wait, what happened? But it just goes to show the deliciousness, the versatility of it. And just when I'm, in doubt, and I'm just like, yeah, let me try Beaujolais with this and see how it goes. What about for you, Keith?
I mean, that sums it up so beautifully, but the only thing I would add is wine itself can be really intimidating, and especially like someone who grew up in a Mormon household and like, oh my gosh, wine, alcohol, evil. And I have never felt kind of any of that pretentiousness, kind of it not accessible from Beaujolais. And I love it as a wine because it is one of the most accessible, just pairs with just about everything. You get cool wines with personality. They're affordable. Even like the most prized allocated one is still a fraction of like Bordeaux or Burgundy. And I love that you get this type of personality, sense of place. And then on a completely selfish thing, I love that it's refreshing red wine.
Yes.
And especially as I'm trying to handle, I will never say adapt to the humidity and heat of living in Texas.
Houston, not so bad up here.
There's something to be said about having refreshing
red
wines,
wine.
And particularly refreshing red wines. And I love that about Beaujolais, that you can just chill it down, crush it, and it is a wine to crush and drink. And even by yourself, like, oh, I didn't mean to drink.
I didn't mean to drink that much.
Yeah.
I had to literally hide these wines from myself because I'm like, nope, do not put them in the refrigerator because you're going to drink them. But like, one thing I just thought of was like this, to your point, is like that the spelling of thoughts about Beaujolais today. So for instance, like we talked about, like, your favorite is like for Thanksgiving, right? So if I were to bring Beaujolais, people are like, Beaujolais, my parents or my great aunt and uncle will be like, wait a minute, isn't that the flower bottle? They have an idea of what Beaujolais is based on Nouveau, right? And then I have my wine snob friends who are the collectors who may be like, I don't know about Beaujolais so much. You know, it's too light, it's too thin, it's too this, to that, or whatever it might be. And then they have it, and they have the food, and they have the conviviality, and they try it, and they're like, oh, I love this wine. You know what I mean? I had no idea. And I think it's just part of that, you know, sharing Beaujolais with people all over the map, whether it's our guests, our friends, our, you know, family.
Yeah, not to be self-serving. This is a lot of times why we taste wines blind, because people come with such prejudice and biases.
About it, yeah.
But I love the concept of the spirit of Beaujolais. And this was a very deliberate choice on our part at Full Circle to end BevCon this year with Beaujolais. I mean, God, what would I given to be together in the same room with all of you instead of doing 2 weeks of Zoom calls? That's why we are, you know. And so I think for us is to toast everyone here with this, you know, sense of great wines, great food, great community coming together. This conviviality is definitely something, and I really hope, unless something goes terribly wrong in this world, that we are going to be together next year drinking Beaujolais and so much more together.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Cheers to that. And for
you.
those of you who will stay with us, we will be here, Keith, Melissa, and I, and some of the vintners will be here too. So you had questions and you're like, how did I get this answered? We will definitely do that. Last slide here is just to give you some reminders. Thank you to Beaujolais.
Yes.
Fantastic. Sopexa for pulling it together. Thank you so much to all our panelists, to Ghislaine, to Pierre-Alexandre, and really to Aurélien. Love that you guys could join us, especially coming off of a difficult time harvest. Please don't forget the survey. It's really important. And especially if you're like, wait, what was the name of that wine again? That's on the survey. What can I get that wine in my market? That's on the survey. So fill that out. And again, thank you guys so much. I will say that Full Circle is super excited that we are going to finally go into in-person events, and we don't have to wait till next year. We are going to be in New York City for Spain's Great Match on November 15th. So if you happen to be in New York, or you're in the surrounding cities and you want to come see us, we're going to be at Mercado Jose Andreas's Little Spain, and I hope to see all of you there. I know that I can't wait with vaccines and all to give you guys